We're going to talk about cross-platform storage and sync. I'm really excited that I made it up this morning. We had a very late night, but it's fun. Good to be back in Canada. A little background on me. I am Canadian, so born and raised in Montreal. So I've been in Toronto, I don't know, for a long time. Worked at Waterloo, so every Friday we pretty much work from Mississauga back in the BlackBerry days. Yeah, you heard my background. I used to be a barista, so that's kind of where I learned how to code. When I took breaks, this guy next to me was freelancing and show me what a matrix terminal looks like back in the day. So that was really cool. And then went off to McGill to do some school over there. You can hit me up. I'm pretty active on Twitter. Used to be working there, so I pretty much answered my emails. Answered my tweets faster than my emails. I think we have an hour today. I would definitely want to give you some time to transition to your next session. So I'm thinking the agenda would be talking about NoSQL, talking about Couchbase and some of the mobile experiences and why this should be something of a consideration for anyone developing a mobile app. We're going to talk about Ionic. Got a really cool guy in front here. It's going to be talking about Ionic. So if you have any in-depth question, you can ask myself, or you can introduce yourself later. So what is NoSQL? Just curious, raise a hand. Anyone know what NoSQL is? That's perfect. That's perfect. That saves a lot of the conversation. But how about NoSQL for mobile? If anyone kind of like combined those two together? No? Sort of? So that's the theme. I want to maybe break this in for those who are unfamiliar a bit about what NoSQL for mobile means. When we talk about concurrent computing, when we talk about operations or where these data points are basically coming in from, you're going to see that explosion already. You don't see as much here right now, but you already see it in Asia. You see it in these really high dense cities. In particular, basically, you have a lot of people that's hyper-connected. You probably have your laptop, your phones, your Fitbit, anything that's wearable. All these things are basically doing writes or reads on some type of database, right? I mean, there's a lot of people that's hyper-connected. So you got the volume of users, you got the number of devices, and mobile is basically one insertion point that's generating all that data. But unfortunately, if you think about what is storing that data, it's pretty much old technology. We're talking about 40-year-old technology, relational databases, and it doesn't fit the mobile trends altogether. That trend is basically unstructured data, right? When you talk about unstructured data, you're talking about, for example, a tweet, right? You're talking about one explicit intent by a user, like let's say checking in on Facebook, garners you 10 data points, right? A lat long time, all that. And that's where this conversation about NoSQL comes in, especially for mobile. For those who are familiar with what UML diagramming looks like, or pivot tables, that's really painful. That's very, very trivial. You can actually take a point and traverse this. And what NoSQL really for us, we're talking about document database, right? For Couchbase, for Mongo, they're basically a different way of looking at how a database looks like. And we're taking basically two tables and flattening that down and making that equivalent to a JSON file, a key value dictionary, right? And you could have nested values there altogether. So that's going to help with your development productivity. That's going to help with the scalability and definitely improving performance. And mobile is a key point because these devices are on the edge. They're right now connected. If you go to TTC in a subway, they're probably not connected. You open up your favorite app, you don't have an experience. So this is the theme we're going to talk about. Who is Couchbase? On the server side, Couchbase is the leading performant server that has scalability and performance built right. It's an open source project. It's an open source project, but yet the developers and customers and people using it are really big names that have a lot of users and basically a lot of operations. So if you think about, this is just some of the names up there, but if you think about like eBay or PayPal, Viber switched from Mongo to Couchbase, and there's a bunch more I can show you too in a demo video very shortly. So it's based on the Apache 2 model. If you're familiar with like Red Hat, we basically our revenue stream is purely support. and what Apple or PayPal uses as a stack, you guys are using the same code. And it's all on GitHub, so I'll talk about that too. So really quickly, the business problem, right? The business problem is actually very simple. So I live in New York now, but come back very frequently, and this is something I actually enjoy every time I step off the plane in Toronto, because that connection is, very nice, very key. In New York, it's not like that, and if you have you go to Blue Jays Stadium or the Raptors game, you probably don't have this connection, right? Because when you think about it, anytime you open your favorite application in an environment that has a lot of people or network traffic or congestion, you're getting this type of experience altogether. And that's really painful, right? Your application itself that you spend time developing, spending a lot of resource trying to adopt the users altogether, they don't see that experience. What they're going to see is probably try again. And that's really unfortunate, because what's really happening is that we're all familiar with basically doing an HTTP REST call to fetch data, right? And pull and push data up to the cloud. But if you don't have that connection, what happens, right? This is usually typically what happens. But for us, we kind of know what to do and try to relieve that pain, but the 99% of the users who's looking at your application, they're just going to go to the App Store and give you a horrible rating, right? And that's really painful. For something like that, you might as well just start again, rebrand it, take it off. It takes a lot of 5-star plus to just balance that, right? My own personal experience, just rip it off. And people usually talk about why they give you 2 stars, and it really attributes to, if you Gaussian graph this and look at the 95 percentiles, it's due to freezing, crashing, slow responsiveness. And this is all attributed to data that's not local, right? All your CRUD operations is somewhere in the cloud. You basically have to go up to the server. If you want to exchange a picture of the guy or the girl next to you, you can't just write something and slide it across. You have to go up the wire, and they have to send it right back down to you. Why? Because that's what we're used to. So what is Couchbase Mobile? That's basically solving this problem. So this problem that we just saw here is only because we're using network resource to pull data up and down. But the way I see it is, typically, if you spend a lot of time making apps, or you work with product managers or UI designers, they design and have all these sticky notes, wireframing on the wall. That's only because that's a perfect world, right? How can you ever transition from one screen to another, one tab to another, if you don't have a connection, right? So to me, offline is a feature. When we talk about with product managers, oh, you want this feature, you want location, you want check-in, those are all features, right? No one actually talks about offline as a feature. Offline for me is the top thing. It's not the bottom, it's the top, because offline is what enables you to have an experience. So if you develop 6 months, 8 months of all your engineering, UI, graphic resources, and then someone downloads the app, doesn't use it, but opens it in the subway, they're not going to see graphics, they're not going to see good UI, good UX, they're going to see this. So offline for me is a feature that enables everything else. And Couchbase for me is that solution. That solution is really a stack, right? This mobile stack, on the client side, you have a framework that lives in your application. Size-wise, really, really small. For those who are developing native, it's about 500 kilobytes to 600 on iOS. Android, of course, is a bit bigger. And there's JavaScript libraries for it. And of course, what we're going to be talking about today is Ionic. And there's the sync part, and then there's Couchbase Server. Server is just something in the back. As a mobile developer, think of it just like your container or somewhere you store data. And it's NoSQL in the back, it's NoSQL in the front. And in the middle is where you have a piece that does your data orchestration. So I'll talk about that. These 3 things are your mobile stack that you would develop with. So the focus would be these 2. So Couchbase Lite itself is the component I think most developers will be touching and using all together. And Sync Gateway, like I mentioned, is the piece that you will write logic to pass data to and from your client-side device, your mobile, or your desktop to the server, to the cloud. Runs on device, a very small footprint like I mentioned. Some of the features for this would be, it's a NoSQL mobile database, hence why I talked about NoSQL. Document storage and schemaless. When I say schemaless, I mean you can kind of massage out a schema anything in production has some sort of like structure, but there's no secondary language like you have to do joins or do queries. It's simply just reading off your keys and values. Run some process, and we're just talking JSON here. Sync gateway here allows you to do data replication. So between server and device, how you would communicate between anything on your mobile application, you'd be running it through sync gateway. You don't need to, because this piece could be abstracted out altogether. You can just simply use Couchbase Lite here as only a local database. What that means is that you can just have it, don't care about syncing up to the cloud. If you want to do REST calls, sure, you can do that too. But at least you can have local persistence, right? You can do all your CRUD operations locally. We have a pluggable authentication. So if you have an LDAP server too, you can route it to that. Or for us, we have Facebook supported outright, but you can pretty much plug in any type of OAuth support or authentication support you guys are using. Where can you find it? If you're an iOS developer, CocoaPods, Maven Central for Android, NuGet if you're a Xamarin or .NET developer. We support 4 .NET runtimes: Mono, Xamarin, Microsoft.NET, and Unity. Unity is for developing games, so there's a big push in that too. PhoneGab, what else? All your desktop, Ionic, PouchDB. If you really want to build from source too, I've got this running on a Raspberry Pi and the Couchbase Lite component on a Raspberry Pi. It's about 430 kilobytes I got it. You can just take things out. It will actually have community pull requests too. It's really cool. So you can see all our issues on GitHub and people contributing to it. So that's really neat. So this is PouchDB. If you haven't heard of it, it's a JavaScript open source a library that lets you do a lot of the offline storage stuff. So why is this relevant? They basically forked the sync gateway component from Couchbase. So from that point of view, you can do the syncing to and from Couchbase server and then to your client-side device by using something like PouchDB. Where does the Ionic framework fit in? Well, if you're not familiar with the Ionic framework here, it's basically an HTML5 and Angular framework where it's basically built on Apache Cordova. It uses like a build once, deploy everywhere kind of strategy. What else can I say here is that you basically build one code set, right? Like you're using HTML5 and you're using AngularJS, and when you deploy that code, you have basically deployed, let's say, on both iOS and Android. So you don't need to know like another subset of languages like Swift or Objective-C. For me, I'm pretty much in Java all the time. I do more Android, but right now I'm doing Swift too. But for this, right, all you need to know is JavaScript and HTML5. The good thing about Ionic frameworks is that it accepts Apache Cordova plugins, right? So out of the box, the Ionic framework is very lightweight. So for those who haven't explored it, definitely take a look at that. What else can I say? Basically, when you install like plugins here, you can just pick and choose components you want, right? Like if you don't need the camera, you don't need to bring it in. And if you do, just bring in that plugin. And then you can use the device like hardware. So what is the Couchbase Cordova plugin? It's basically the ability to give you that piece, right? The Couchbase Lite piece for your mobile application. So the Couchbase Lite plugin is basically compatible with both Android and iOS. Makes Couchbase Lite accessible via the REST APIs, and you can basically communicate to your device, to the local storage Couchbase Lite through RESTful APIs. There's also NG Couchbase Lite wrapper here, which is basically like an AngularJS library. JavaScript library that will allow you to access the features of Couchbase Lite through functions rather than REST APIs. So you have a brief understanding of the stack and what we're trying to do here. I want to show you a quick demo of how somebody basically uses Couchbase Mobile as a stack, and you can see the improvements from their previous application versus what they have now in the App Store. So let me talk through this really quickly for those who are maybe in the back and didn't see it in here. So basically, Ryanair's app on Android and iOS prior to Couchbase was not just Ryanair, but a lot of airline applications. If you travel, you probably experience, for example, Delta, U.S. Airways, well, not anymore, but United. They all have their application, and some of them have booking process. Some of them just have like a check-in process. Nonetheless, it's painful. If you ever try to book something, let's say, decide to go to another screen or you shut down your application, none of those data points are saved. Basically, you have to go up the wire again to fetch the same data that you just got. You're doing the same GET request again and again. So for something like this, right, the bottom is showing real time, the different milestones or points in the process of booking a ticket. And the bottom one is showing the right-hand experience. The top line is showing the left-hand experience. But essentially over here, a lot of the graphics is already downloaded, right? Like imagine the seats are every time this app opens, the seating icon is basically going up the wire to get it again. Instead, the bottom one on the right-hand side app is just reading it locally. So you have a set of things that if it's going to be a constant experience, you don't have to go up the wire again and again to get those assets. So that's why the experience is better. On top of that, the number they save, I think overall 80 gigs a day down to 10 gigs a day overall for everyone using this application is a win too. So next I want to talk about, so they did this natively. Over here I want to talk about maybe some of the high level points of how to get started, maybe what you can do overall to create an application with Couchbase and Ionic. So basically, like anything, you start with the HTML side of things. So over here, we have a template, which is an index.html file. It's essentially where we have RR scripts and CSS to be included, so that's why you have a script there. Everything's broken down using AngularJS UI router into separate partial files. In this case, for example, we have to-do list.html. So this is a to-do list application, to-do app. It's also on GitHub, so I can give you the link later. The to-do list partial file, this is responsible for all the UI related to show all the list items. You can see that essentially is HTML with some AngularJS. It has a few Ionic tags, but they are XML in structure. So if you're familiar with HTML, it's very similar in that sense. Then you have your app.js. So jumping away to from the HTML side of things, all the logic is in our app.js file here. It does not have to be, but you can have it broken down further. But in this case, it is. So this is where code is broken into controllers, and in our controllers, you have functions for handling the views. That's going to get rendered to the user. Basic login, so skipping over all the initialization items. For example, the login controller. This is responsible for starting a replication between our Couchbase Lite and then to sync gateway. So we can do continuous replication, or we can do it ad hoc. So ad hoc, think of it like if you attach it to an intent, meaning that on app exit, you can basically push all your local data that's on device to the cloud. And on app start, you can decide to go fetch, do a pull, if you have that connection to update anything that's local. So you'll be pulling from the server down to your local device. So this is where you do all the sync replication between the device that you're maybe holding and where on your mobile, and then using sync gateway to the source of truth. The way I see it, that when I talk to a lot of database developers or operations folks, they always think the server is a source of truth. For me, there is no master slave or primary, secondary. When we talk about this stuff, we talk about eventual consistency. So what that means is that your device could be the source of truth, right? It can have the latest and greatest data points. The server itself hasn't been updated because you haven't synced that data upwards. And when you do have it as an opportunity, logic-wise or situational-wise, your server will also be replicated having the same data points as your mobile if you wanted to. So there is no concept of who is the source or who is the master unless you want to denote it as that. What we call is master-master replication. So looking at the to-do list controller over here, which is responsible for listening for changes that might have been pulled in from the server, as well as pushing things up if you choose to insert data. So there's another controller that's doing that. And then, of course, I'll show you the sample here, but you can just delete things too. You have the task controller. It's pretty similar. It's doing essentially the same thing, but in this case, it basically does not get the list item here. It's getting a task. So the application, the sample application, you have two basic categories. You have a list category, you have a task category. So I'll show you this in this next slide. So we're talking basically now a type list and a type task. And both of these are in their separate documents, and they're related to each other. So over here, so these are tasks. Excuse me, these are lists, and these are tasks. So the list is associated to a task. The task, excuse me, is associated to a list. So this is what we're describing here. So when you insert a document, over here, let's say I decide to, let's say Toronto. That's persisted. When I insert a document, you can see that it basically takes a JavaScript object and you insert it directly into Couchbase Lite without any manipulation. The database transaction here returns a promise to remain like asynchronous. Couchbase view, elaborating a bit on this, is that with HTML5 like local storage, you're probably going to serialize data into a single property. The single property is going to become quite large and hard to maintain. So you're going to do lookups with like one key name that you probably remember. With a NoSQL document, you're going to basically have many documents, which you probably won't remember the key name, the names for. So to get these documents, you're going to need to design a view, and then you query it. In the case of this to-do Lite example, there are basically two views. A view for lists and a view for tasks that exists inside, that exists in a list, basically. Querying Couchbase view. So querying the list view basically will return lists, but of course, in a promise to remain asynchronous. You probably have the option to pass a start key here, which is an obvious example for querying the task views. If you don't want to query all the tasks, only a particular task to go over a list, then you can do that too. Just depends when you decide to. You can update that start key accordingly. And the replication, right? This is the. I look at this as a value prop because you can talk about like, yeah, I don't need a database altogether, but if you ever done any packet sniffing or Wiresharking with data, and you ever try to write your own synchronization protocol, it is painful. This stuff is abstracted out altogether. So the syncing is abstracted, the conflict resolution is abstracted. So it will basically asynchronously happen in the background if you update, if somebody updates a particular document, goes up to the cloud, we don't do the hosting, so whatever server you guys, whatever box you guys have, and then you're basically referencing the same URL endpoint. That URL is like an IP to your server. And then there's a change on the server side. That stuff will basically be pushed down to your device. So you're basically writing UI code, UX code here, that whole experience. So once the local starts replicating up, we can also replicate the sync gateway down to the local. So you can start two replication processes here. Really quickly, sync gateway. This could be a talk in itself. This is where you will write that logic, right? So you're basically writing JavaScript functions here that determine who you want to sync to, the type of document. If you want to give people access, read access or write access to a particular document, you can also do that. So all documents that hit the sync gateway basically will be checked. If the type property of a document is task, then the sync gateway checks to see if it's a list_ID is present before it saves it. So that's what it's doing here. Otherwise, if the type, excuse me, is a list, we basically check to make sure the owner exists. And if it does, you can sync that up. So it's another way to do provisioning or privacy within Sync Gateway as well. Some resources. Okay, so where can you find some of this stuff? Definitely hit up the portal. I put a bit.ly, so it's easier to write it down. To download this stuff too, it's all open source. And there's a blog on this too. I can show you that. And for this sample and this code, you can hit up the GitHub link. There's also a mini hack that myself, I contribute to. You can pretty much get up and running in 30, 40 an hour, building an application from scratch, putting in some code that you can see the core ideas of a local device, a local database working. And then the sync is abstracted out. Basically, we have a hosted URL, a server, and you basically, you'll be updating to that demo server. Otherwise, you can play around if you have your own, provider. Myself, I use DigitalOcean. I also use AWS. But essentially, anything. You can do it locally too. So for any questions, you can hit me up. I'm here to answer some questions too. 10 minutes back to you, like I promised. Thank you.